Hello, welcome back to Let's Talk Title with Emerald Coast Title Services. I'm host and president of ECTS, Dion Moniz.
And I am co-host Ashley Bowen. I'm a licensed title agent and director of operations for Emerald Coast Title Services.
All right, so today we want to talk about what happens when you're under contract to buy a house and there's mold. What are the buyer's remedies or options at that point? So first of all, we should specify that we're in Florida, so
mold is everywhere.
Mold is everywhere.
We're very humid here in Florida.
Florida is basically a swamp. So there's going to be some level of mold in your house regardless. It's the bad mold that we are going to talk about today. Most of you know it as black mold, or the stuff that can cause health issues. So ironically, as much as mold is an issue in Florida, the Florida contracts don't actually have a built-in provision for mold except for under Section 10C, where it basically says, under disclosures, it says mold is naturally occurring and may cause health risks or damage to property. If buyer is concerned or desires additional information regarding mold, buyer should contact an appropriate professional, CRSP Rider R, which is the mold inspection rider.
So if you fail to include Rider I, but you go and get a mold inspection and it comes back with mold, then you really don't have anything to go back to the seller and say, please fix this problem, because you didn't include Rider I. It is not a part of the general repairs in the contract.
It's not one of the items that is a warranted item that has to be repaired under the repair or inspection section of the contract. So unless, my opinion as a lawyer is, unless you can prove the seller knew that the mold was there, and again, we're talking about bad mold or black mold, unless the seller knew it was there, then the buyer has no recourse, unless Rider I is included. If you can somehow prove the seller knew that the house was infested with black mold and didn't disclose that, then you might have an argument there to say, look, you should have told me since you knew, and you didn't. Had you informed me, I would have included Rider I and gotten a professional inspection, etc. So I think buyer has some leverage there to maybe get the seller to try to remediate or else get into litigation.
If the seller knew, and a lot of our properties,
good luck proving that. Yeah.
And the seller doesn't live here most of the time. And that provision, 10C, is in both the residential contract and the as-is. So this will work for either contract that you choose to use.
So there is an exception. If you're under an as-is contract and you find out there's mold within the inspection period, then you have an out, because the as-is contract has an absolute right to cancel. Now, under the regular contract, you don't get that unless you put an as-is rider or a right to cancel rider with the regular contract, or you add Rider I for the mold inspection. And so let's get into what Rider I talks about.
What does Rider I say?
So under Rider I, and actually the mold inspection riders between FARBAR and CRSP are slightly different. But we'll talk about. Imagine that.
Just use the FARBAR contract.
yes, we prefer FARBAR, but I'll go over the nuances between the two. But first we'll talk about FARBAR. So basically, Rider I under the FARBAR contract says the default is 20 days from the effective date, unless you specify otherwise, and they call that the mold inspection period. And so if a mold inspection comes back with something, the buyer has to submit that report to seller within the mold inspection period, and then it's buyer's sole discretion to either cancel the contract, try to work something out with seller, or proceed as is. I say as is. Proceed with basically waive the mold inspection rider. But I like that it gives the buyer an absolute out.
Yeah.
As long as there's a certified mold inspector that says, yeah, there's bad mold. It has to be outside the normal limits. It can't just be any mold, because again, every house has some extent of mold in the house because we're in Florida. So again, if there's mold outside the normal limits in the report, buyer submits it within the mold inspection period, buyer can get out. Now, the caveat is if there's been if any damage occurred from the mold testing, buyer has an obligation to put the property back to its pre-inspection condition if buyer doesn't close.
Which is the same rule for any other inspections that we have.
Yes, exactly. So that's under the FAR Rider I for mold. Under CRSP, it's Rider R. And CRSP also has the default 20-day mold inspection period. But CRSP gives the buyer an additional 3 days outside of mold inspection period to present the report to the seller. And then if that's done within 3 days, so you got mold inspection period, then you get a 3-day window after that to present the report. So
They always
an
try to
extra
make
3
it
days.
so confusing.
I know, right? Exactly. But after that, it's pretty much the same. Buyer can back out if they want. Under both circumstances, FAR and CRSP, buyer gets the EMD back if they cancel within the requisite deadline. And also under CRSP, the buyer has to repair any damages caused by the inspection.
So does the mold inspection rider obligate the seller to pay any money to fix it?
Thank you. Yes, that is one thing I forgot. There is a blank. There's basically a repair limit blank in each of the riders. The default is $500. So thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that because I went over that part. If the cost to remediate the mold is in excess of the amount stated in the rider, then that triggers the buyer's ability to cancel. Sorry, I completely glossed over that part.
So if it's within the $500 limit, if that's what you left it at, then the seller is obligated to repair.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yes. Only if it exceeds that does the buyer get the ability to cancel and say, no, I don't want you to fix it. I don't want this house. I'm out. Give me my money back, my EMD. But yes, if it's within the mold repair limit is what I'll call it. If it's within that stated amount in there, and again, the default is $500 for both. If it's under that, seller can fix it and buyer's still locked in. Buyer's ability to cancel doesn't trigger unless it's outside that bucket.
Okay. So I think if you have a buyer who is concerned at all about mold, or if they have maybe some previous health problems and are going to want a mold inspection, don't forget to include the mold inspection rider so that you're making the seller obligated to make some repairs if they find anything, and at least get yourself an out. Because if you don't have that and you find mold, you're pretty much stuck with the property unless you have the as-is right to inspect, right to cancel.
Yep. But here's the quandary that the seller has. Okay, so under a normal contract, no rider, seller doesn't have an obligation to remediate under that contract. But now the seller knows that there's mold outside normal limits. So even if seller says no to the first buyer, take a hike, I'm not fixing it, now the seller has an obligation to report it to the next buyer because now they know about it.
And that next buyer is also going to want it fixed.
And then the next buyer is going to want it fixed. So from a practical standpoint, the seller just needs to go ahead and fix it. Otherwise, they're going to have issues down the road for future buyers.
And mold grows.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's just going to stop.
Right.
It'll keep getting
Exactly.
worse.
Yeah. So again, practically, if there's mold, work it out, get it remediated. If it's really bad, obviously, that's a whole different story. But if you're a buyer in Florida and you want to be sure, include that mold inspection rider with the contract, and that'll make sure that you're protected.
It's very interesting that we do live here, and I very rarely see a mold inspection rider on any of these contracts. But the reason that we brought this to you today is because the same thing happened on one of the files that we were working on. It was a residential contract for sale and purchase. No mold rider. Mold was found, and then the realtors called Dion and said, "What do we do now?"
Yeah, and I had never really had it come up, and so I had to actually go through the contract and learn myself that it's not addressed in the regular contract because that's something that I've never really had to focus on.
But Dion used his brain and said, "Mr. Seller, you either fix it now or you have to fix it later, because now you know about it."
Yeah.
And so they moved forward.
Exactly.
And we're closing next week.
They worked it out, which is what they should have done. So, but anyway, we wanted you to be aware. It has come up, and it will come up again. So now you are properly educated on your options if you are a buyer and you're in a contract and mold happens.
Because this is Florida, mold happens.
Yes. All right, so that's it for that topic, right?
Quick and easy.
Quick and easy. So we hope that helps. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact us and let us know. We're also always interested in new topics that we can cover, so let us know about that. Otherwise, we hope you'll follow us on all of our social media pages or go to our website, ects.com. And until then, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.